Shalom. In the previous video, we began to study the issue of העברת נחלה. The issue of העברת נחלה involves the prohibition against disinheriting Torah heirs, meaning as follows. Let's assume, and it's an accurate assumption, that there are techniques available which are recognized as halachically valid, by which one can determine the division of his estate, his or her estate, in a manner different from the default division of an estate up in Torah. For example, if a person passes away and he leaves a wife and sons and daughters, then according to Torah law, only the sons inherit. The wife, the daughters, they have other provisions that Chazal made for their economic well-being. Mizonot from the Zavon, etc., Ketubah. But al pi din Torah, only the sons actually inherit the assets of the estate. But there are techniques, which we will study in a subsequent video, which make it possible to halachically divide the estate in a different manner. For example, to give one's estate to one's spouse, to give one's estate to sons and daughters equally, for example. But as we saw in the Mishnah, Masech Ba'avatra, if a person does exploit the halachic techniques available to him and disinherits, even if only partially, the Torah heirs, if it's halachically valid, then it's halachically valid, it's binding, but the Chachamim felt that it was not the appropriate derech to behave in such a manner. We will now continue to see the opinions of various poskim on this issue. Perhaps we should remind ourselves of two basic points of view in the Gemara. Let's take a look at one or two of the slides that we saw in the last video. First, we have this Gemara from Masechet Ketubot. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Let's just make it a little bit clearer here. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon Yochai Mepnei Ma'it Kinu Ketubah bin Dichrin, a Ketubah which gives one wife's heirs all of her dowry, even if the husband subsequently remarries and he has other sons, they would not inherit from the funds which originated with her dowry. That's Ketubah bin Dichrin. We saw that last time. The reason that Chachamim were matkin such a takana is kedei sheikpotz adam v'yachtov lebito kibno, in order to encourage fathers to give an appropriate dowry for their daughters. Provision had to be made to ensure that the money would stay within the family and would not be diverted to subsequent sons that the husband may have in a subsequent marriage, if, God forbid, the daughter should die before he does. But then the Gemara says, is there such a thing which on one hand the Torah says that only a son can inherit, daughter does not inherit? And then Chachamim kamu metakne detirot brata, and there mitakene takana, which in effect gives the daughter an inheritance, or at least the daughter's children, the daughter's sons, an inheritance. So the answer is Hanami do Raita udechtiv k'chu nashim v'olidu banim v'banot v'k'chu libnechem nashim v'bnotechem tenu la'anashim. The Torah, it's actually in the Navi. The pasuk encourages to fathers to find husbands for their daughters. Bishlam banim, the sons, b'yadei kaima. They have the power to go out and determine or find a shidduch for themselves. The daughters are not in control on their own. So therefore, therefore the pasuk comes and tells us the nil b'shev and nichse, we should give them clothing and chasim, the native lemide, and give them a basis, an economic basis, in order that the men should come willingly jump to take the shidduch, and they will come and marry the daughter. So then the Gemara asks, but even if you don't leave anything at all to the sons, you give everything away as a dowry, would that be okay? So the answer is no. If the effect of your giving a dowry to a daughter is that nothing at all is left over to be divided according to Torah law, then there's no takana. In other words, there has to be some remnant of Yerusha Doraita, even if you give most of your estate away because of other motives, such as providing for a daughter's dowry. So on the one hand, we have this idea that you cannot disinherit your Torah heirs. On the other hand, you have the exception to that rule, where there is an equally significant purpose in diverting the estate from the sons to the daughters to find the shidduch in this case. And thirdly, that even if you divert the assets away from your sons, you have to leave them some small semblance, at least, of Yerusha. Motar dinar is obviously not a very large sum, but Motar dinar at least preserves the principle of Yerusha min Torah. There is a Yerusha that passes from father to son, and the fact that other assets pass elsewhere doesn't interfere with that basic phenomena. That was the Gemara that we saw on Daf Nun Bet Amud Bet, but then there was another piece of Gemara that we saw last time, where we won't learn the whole Gemara again, but we saw that Yehuda bar Merimar was reluctant to accompany Rav Papa when he went into the Mechutin's house, Be'aba Surah, to close the deal on the shidduch for his son, because Yehuda bar Merimar felt that any nedunya that would be agreed upon would be a divergence from Yerusha Doraita, and he didn't want to lend any legitimacy to that by his very presence. Now that, in effect, is contrary to the previous Gemara, because the previous Gemara said that as long as you leave something to the sons, the fact that you give part of your estate as a dowry doesn't invoke the displeasure of the Chachamim, because the dowry is equally important, as we've seen. Yehuda bar Meimar took a much more extreme position. His position was that there is no justification for diverting the estate from the heirs, and therefore he was reluctant to enter into the home of the Mechutin when the Tanaim of the Ketubah were being agreed upon. So we see already in the Gemara two separate opinions as to whether there's any circumstances under which diverting the estate from the Torah heirs would be acceptable. Going back now to the poskim that we want to take a look at going forward, we will see various opinions on that issue. Just a second, and we will take this out of play, and we will go back to these slides here. Okay. The first piece here is the Rambam. The Rambam in Hilchot Nachalot tells us, Kol hanoten nechasav la'acherim v'hiniach hayorshim. He disinherits his yorshim. Af al pi she'ein hayorshim noagim kashua. Even though these yorshim that he disinherits do not behave properly. And notice there's a girsah here, noagim bo kashua. In other words, the question isn't whether they behave properly in general, but whether or not they behave properly vis-a-vis the testator himself. Did they behave properly in the way in which they dealt with their father, for example? Did they respect him? Did they help him in his time of need? Did they refrain from insulting him, or in the other way, speaking badly about him? And even in such a case, not only if they were Einam Yoshim Kashura in general, but even if the father feels that they behave negatively klapav, still if he disinherits them. On the other hand, as a legal matter, the gifts that he gives to achirim are valid gifts, and those other people that he gives the estate to will in fact be zochet to whatever he gives them. In other words, it's a ein ruach chachamim l'chaimenu is a moral judgment about the displeasure of the chachamim, but it doesn't impact on the validity of whatever transactions he may have completed during his lifetime in giving his estate away to others. Midat Chasidut tells us the Rambam, Shelo ya'id adam chasid b'tzava'a shemavrim bo Yerusha min hayoresh. Not only the person who writes the will himself is warned against Ruach HaChamim not being Nochaimenu, but Midat Chasidut, that even if you are asked to attest to the will, to be a witness to the will, you are to lend a hand to such a will which disinherits the Torah heirs, even then you should refrain from doing so. Afilu miben she'eino nohei kashura, in favor of le'achiv chacham v'nohei kashura. Even in such a case, you should not take part in the execution of such a will. The Rambam continues with a halacha which the Torah is not directly connected to Hilchot Nachalot, even though that's where it is to be found. Tzivu chachamim shelo yeshaneh adam bein habanim b'chayav, that you shouldn't discriminate between your children during your lifetime. Afilu b'davar muat, even in small matters. Shelo yavo lidei tacharut v'kina kachei Yosef im Yosef. It's a Gemara Masechet Shabbat that you shouldn't create any unnecessary jealousy or competition among your children by showing favoritism to one of them over the other. Now, even though this halacha has to do with the way in which you behave towards your children during your lifetime, still, the Rambam brought this halacha in Hilchot Nachlot and close by to the previous halacha that we saw in order to indicate that the prohibition or the injunction, if you will, that a person should not show favoritism during his lifetime applies equally after death, so that one should not show favoritism to one child over the other in the way in which he divides his estate. Ella, the estate should be divided equally among all of them. The creation of tacharut and kin'ah, which accompanies this kind of discrimination, can be just as intense, v'ulai afilu even more intense after death, when this or that child feels that the father discriminated against him unjustly. That can be something that can't be fixed and can never be undone. The father is already not among the living. So the Rambam puts this halacha into Hilchot Nachalot in order to indicate that the same considerations that apply during lifetime are just as valid after death. In any event, the Rambam makes no distinction between a motar dinar or low motar dinar. The Rambam doesn't make any distinction between dowries or any other legitimate purpose. The Rambam states a categoric isur, that or at least a categoric displeasure of Chachamim for what he does, no matter what the reason and no matter how much or how little of the estate he diverts from the Torah heirs. The Rosh similarly tells us, the question was whether one could validly give one's estate just to the Bechor, to the oldest. The Rosh is even more categoric and adamant than the Lashon that we saw, the Nusach of the Rambam, in that it's afilu asur la'alot al alev davar kazeh. And he brings the Mishnah. במקום בניו, אין רוח חכמים נוחה ממנו. הוא מסיק בגמרא, אפילו מברא בישל לברתיו, even from a bad son to a good son. So the Rosh sees these words, אין רוח חכמים נוחה ממנו, in their fullest severity, to invoke the displeasure of Chachamim on the level that the Mishnah uses that language is no small matter. And Rosh is much more adamant even than the Rambam, asur lahalot al libo davar zeh. On the other hand, the Knesset Gdolah, later than the Rosh, who says, Amar Amasev, Yereli, Shelo Amru, Ein Ruach Chachamim Nochaim Eno Ladavka Bekotev Nechasav La'acherim V'iniach Lebanav. The Lashon of the Mishnah, as we've seen, and as the Rambam is Menasechet, we go back and take a look. The Rambam says, Kol Na'anotei Nechasav La'acherim V'heiniach Hayoshim. And it could be interpreted to mean V'heiniach as meaning that he totally disinherits them. not just discriminates between them. And that's the way that the Knesset Agdola explains the Nusach. Shlom ro yircham yochei menu ela dafka bekotev lechasav lachirim ve'niach lebanav, aval benoten lechasav le'achad mibanav, kigon sheriba le'achad u'miet la'acher, he just changes the proportions. Instead of dividing the estate equally among his sons, he gives more to one son, less to another son. Afagav damar Shmuel l'rav Shela lo teve bavurach santa, you should not be a mavir nachala. Afilu mibra bishul lebratava, it should be bratava, there's a typo here. Afilu from a bad son to a good son. Eino bichlal dein ruach chachamim nochaimen. If that's what you do, there's no displeasure here. Afagav she'ein ra'ui l'adam liot eid o dayan lavurach santa afilu mibra bishul lebratava, even to be a witness. But if he does give all of his sons something, it's just that he divides the estate differently than a 50-50. In that case, there's no displeasure of the Chachamim. There may very well be valid reasons, justifiable reasons for discriminating among the sons in such a way that you do give to all of them, but more to one, less to another. There may be one son that's much more needy than the other. Maybe the one son who has medical problems and needs more financial support. There may be justifications. We saw in the Gemara that to give a dowry to a daughter is a justification for deviating from division of the estate equally. And there may be others as well. And we will see as we progress the different criteria which can be applied to justify the Havarat Nachala, even if we accept as a rule that one should not be Mavir. Here you have the Shulchan Aruch's formulation, which is exactly the same as the Rambam's. And it includes the word Noagim Bo Kashura. The gifts are valid, but ein ruach chachamim nochai. Umidat chasidut shelo laha'id b'tzava shemagrim ba'yerusha me'ayoresh. Filu mibein she'eino nohei kashura la'achiv chacham v'nohei kashura. That's the Rambam's formulation, and the Shulchan Aruch brings it word for word. The Ramah adds a very interesting addition here. Let's say that that's what all he says in his will. I hereby leave my estate in such a way that it should be divided in the best possible way. Then what do you do? The answer is Yitneu Yosham, meaning the Yoshim al Pidin Torah. He ain't tov mizeh. That's the best alternative. Clearly, there could be very few instances when a person would write a will in such a way, because if that's all he's going to write, then the same result would come about even if he didn't write the will. If he didn't write the will, then the estate would pass to his Torah heirs. We're talking about in a purely halachic, closed halachic system. We're not talking now in terms of local law, which may be different than halakha. We're talking about now. We'll get to the question of local law when we deal with techniques, but for now we're talking about a totally closed halachic system. If a person writes shi'asu b'nechasav hatov she'efshar la'asot, then it goes to his heirs, to whom the assets would go, even if he had not written anything. Okay, the Aruch HaShulchan takes the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch at face value, and explains what they say in such a way that it is clear that there are no exceptions. Rambam Shulchan Aruch, and etc. Ad kan l'shano. He quotes the Shulchan Aruch of the Rambam, and he says, "V'nired afilu gam meniach ma'at lebanav l'kayem nachla doraita." Even if he does leave some portion of his estate to his sons in order that there should be a nachla doraita, like the motar dinar that we saw in one day of the Gemara, like we saw in the Knesset Agdola, gam ken ein la'asot ken. The Ratzon Hashem Yitbarach hu she'abanim yeshu avotehem v'lo yitnum la'achirim. There are no exceptions here. Even if riba le'achad v'mi'et la'sheni, even if you want to give a dowry, if you want to provide for your more needy sons, you have a problem. According to the Aruch HaShulchan, you should not do so. I didn't bring the text in any of the slides here, but you have in the Chatam Sofer, and even more in detail in the Tshuvot, in the Tshuvah of the Minchat Yitzchak, we will see pieces of his Tshuvah as we go along that raise the issue that if a dowry is considered to be Havarat Nachala, That means that even if you are giving away your assets outside the context of your will, you're talking about a lifetime transaction. You're not thinking about wills, b'chlal. You want to give your daughter a dowry. And the Gemara deals with that issue as a question of Havarat Nachala. The Gemara asked, how can you make such takana if it results in the Nachala being transferred to the daughter? What about if I want to buy my daughter a birthday present? Any money that I give my daughter is that much less than would be in my savings account, and that much less that my sons will ultimately inherit. Or what if I buy myself an extra pair of shoes? That money is not going to be available for division to the estate. So obviously you have to make some sort of a distinction between transactions which are death-oriented as opposed to normal everyday transactions that one person does during his lifetime, and such things would presumably not be included b'chlal in the Isur of Havarat Nachala. We're talking here a division in terms of the estate, in terms of a will, and that's why the Shulchan Aruch, the Rambam, and here the Aruch HaShulchan all bring this tzava'ah, and that's why they talk about not being even me'id but tzava'ah, because it is through the vehicle of the tzava'ah that there is a Havarat Nachala which invokes the Ein Ruach Chachamim L'Chaimed, as opposed to lifetime transactions. It is very difficult to accept that there would be some sort of a limit on the legitimate ability to give assets as you see fit. On the other hand, you may recall that we saw in the Moreh Nevuchim of the Rambam. The Rambam encourages fathers not to give away their money during lifetime in such a way that it would diminish the amount of the estate that would be available for division among his Torah heirs. He talks about it there also on moral terms, because the family members are all dependent on him during his lifetime, and therefore he should maximize the economic basis for their continued support after his death, which would be impacted negatively if he were to give away any significant portion of his estate during his lifetime. So we have this very interesting balance that all of the poskim are concerned with. On the one hand, to ensure that the Torah heirs are still remain in the picture. On the other hand, to allow some freedom to the owner of assets to be able to dispose of his assets as he sees fit during his lifetime. The Ktsos, therefore, in order to balance out the Shulchan Aruch and opposed completely to what the Aruch HaShulchan says that we just saw, the Ktsos brings the Tashbeitz, and the Tashbeitz says that Tofsei Shtarot L'Rishonim, there were already forms of Shtarot. We'll see it more when we get to subsequent slides. There were Shtarot in which you could halachically dispose of at least some of your estate to your daughters, for example. And the forms include a provision for the Torah heirs of some minimal amount, the Dalet Zuz, which is the same as the Motar Dinar. And the Tashbeit says, why was there this hakpada? Why was there this concern that the Shtarot include some minimal gift to the Torah heirs? And with Tofsei Shtarot, we should have Yeshua Bazuzah, the Katav Gaon Zal, the Tashbeit, the Mishum Kadei Shetehei Ruach Chachamim L'Chaim, Shetehei Ruach Chachamim, that by preserving the essence of Yerusha, by ensuring that at least some part of your estate passes to your sons, then Ruach Chachamim is Nochaim, because then you've accomplished the purpose for which the Isur of Havarat Nachala exists, and that is in order to ensure that there be some process of Yerusha, Noraita, even if the majority of your assets are diverted to other heirs, in this case, the daughter. The Mivchanim L'Chofesh HaTzivui, the criteria for the freedom of testation, we find in the Shuvot of Poskim that are Mekel. Aruch HaShulchan is clearly not one of them. He's very machmir, but we just saw the Ktsot. But we'll see in the Poskim who are willing to consider that there are legitimate concerns which justify diverting one's estate, at least partially, from the Torah heirs to others. And we'll see the different criteria that are applied in order to be matir, in order to allow for these diversions. The first criteria is zehutam shel yorshim alternativim. Who are these alternate heirs that you want to give a portion of your estate to? Is it your daughters? Is it your spouse? Or is it some friend of yours? Or is it a Mossad Staka, for example, which is also a diversion from Yerusha Doraita? Now, which of those are legitimate alternatives and which are perhaps not? So let's see what the different poskim say about this. First, Maram Mintz brings Zeo Taima Didan Noten Shtar Yerusha Lebanot Be'elu Medinot. He talks about there the need to provide for the economic well-being of the daughters. And there he says that's why in the Shtar Yerusha for Banot, which we'll discuss in a future video, among the techniques that are available, he said that's why we do it. We do it because it is legitimate to provide for their financial well-being. The Nachlat Shiva, which is a very influential sefer, including many forms of different shtarot, transactions that are drafted halachically, he writes there that the kol ikar mishum kach nitkan shtar chatzi zachar. The shtar chatzi zachar is the same as this shtar Yerusha lebanot. Again, we'll discuss this in a future video. But the point is that there is a shtar whereby you can halachically transmit a portion of your estate to your daughters. The reason for that is kidei shetehei chaviva al ba'ala kol shah. In order to make sure that the husband is happy with his wife, at least on the level of economic well-being, it takes a lot of pressure off of the zug to the extent that the daughter's father guarantees that part of his estate will be given to the daughter, given to this husband's wife. Mishum she'achatan ro'eh shechamav noten lo shtar chatzi zachar v'kemat b'chashvo kebein. His father-in-law gives him this shtar chatzi zachar, which again is the shtar whereby the daughter will inherit a portion of the estate, and he feels that this makes him a member of the family, basically. That can contribute to shalom bayit. Okay, but then the question is, when we talk about kadei shetehei chaviva ba'ala kol sha'ah, this is not only when a person is trying to assist his daughter in finding a shidduch. It's even after she's already married. So you have a daughter who's married, and you want to be able to give her some portion of the estate. This is no longer an issue of kadeshi yikpots, that the chassan should come and agree to the shidduch. And the Minchat Yitzchak makes it clear that that's the case. The bebanot shayach takanta derabanan benogea linedunya, when you're talking about when she's still single. Uchemochein shayach b'chol ma shenoten lebito kedei lechav bano bala. At any point in their the daughter's life, even if it's after she's already married. That's the Minchat Yitzchak, and he adds again, when the benogea lebanot ein sham safek yachol lahanchil la ba'ofen hamo'il chelek min chasa. He says that chad mashma'it, that it is permissible to give your daughters a portion of your estate. There is no ein ruach hachamim nochai menu, and all that would be left for us is to determine how to do it in a halachically valid way, which is the shtar Yerusha lebanot, which we'll discuss again in a future video. So that's Benot HaMorish is definitely an acceptable alternative, which does not invoke the displeasure of Chazal. The second would be the spouse. Again, the Minchat Yitzchak, it's this one tshuva, Chelek Gimel Siman Kuf Lamed Hey. It's a very long tshuva. The tshuva has to deal with all the aspects of the Havarat נחala. It is a classic in terms of the depth and scope of the analysis. But he says there, Benogel Ishto, Shagam Chachamenu Zal Shaktu Harbe Al Takanata. Already Chazal were doeg for the financial well-being of the woman, as for example, with a ketubah. B'im kein hasvara notenet, she'im abal ro'eh, she'im lo yechazek et zchuyotel. If the Baal assesses the situation, and he realizes that if he doesn't strengthen his wife's zchuyot in his assets, be'ezeh ofen chuki, in some legal form, as tisher almana nodedet bli mishan l'shena, then she'll remain a destitute widow without a support system, then b'vadai ein kam mishum ha'avarat nachala, because that is just as legitimate a concern to make sure that she has a financial leg to stand on. Obviously, you have issues here with the question of whether or not she does have independent means of support, in which case this particular type of exemption would be more problematic. But even then, the question is to what extent the estate would enhance her economic situation, her financial ability to go forward. The Bechor is a simpler situation. The question is whether or not you can deny the Bechor his double portion and divide the estate equally between him and the other sons. And the answer is, Efshar the Kivan de im it chelek Bechora midin Yerusha. The chelek of the Bechora is excluded from Yerusha. The double portion of the Bechor is not considered to be part of his inheritance. It's the matana kayirachmana. It is considered a gift, and therefore, l'dugma, eino notel b'shevach, v'lo ra'ui b'muchzak. The Bechor does not take certain aspects of the estate assets the way that a regular heir does, at least in his double portion. He obviously has one portion which is equal to the sons, but the double portion would not take any of the appreciation or the value of the assets. That's the shevach. He would not take collectibles that have not been collected at the time of the father's death. For example, if there are people who owe him money, for example, if it's not in his hands at the time of death, then the Bechor would not take a pishtayim in those assets. It's all sugya in Baba Batra. But the point is that the fact that the Bechor is excluded from these elements proves that it's a matana, it's not a Yerusha. And therefore, eno b'chlal zeh shel avarat nachala. It's not relevant to avarat nachala. And therefore, if you divide the estate equally, you are not being over on any isurim or even ruach chachamim and ruach chachamim nochaim, and it would not be applicable when you're talking about the Bechor. The next element that is relevant is what happens if you want to give a portion of your estate to tzedakah. And this is already a larger sugya, and we will therefore discuss tzedakah and some of the other criteria for being mekel and avarat nachla in the next video. That's it for now.